This lecture introduces China and Chinese art before 1279. We will begin with the prehistoric period in this very diverse region and very populated region up to the Qin and Han dynasties. Now, we know very little actually about China because we've only begun excavations since the 1920s. This is incredibly recently compared to other regions such as the Middle East. Thus, the history of China has been rewritten repeatedly. It is a very distinctive civilization that develops here that has advances early on in ceramics and metalwork as well as jade. They're going to develop the potter's wheel, reduction firing, high-fired stoneware, and porcelain. All of this will be very prized and will be traded along the Silk Road and elsewhere, making its way to the West. This area of the world is going to have 8,000 years of civilization associated with it, on a landmass that's actually larger than the continental United States, that has 1/5 of the world's entire population. The area is divided into different regions by 3 rivers and a mountain range. So this is going to include the Yellow River, or Huanghe, the central river here, the Yangtze, and then the southern river here, the Xi. So these rivers divide up the areas in China as well as a vastly different ecology from south to north. Thus, northern China and north of these mountains, the Qinling Mountains, we find will be drier and more harsh and rugged, whereas the southern region is going to be more appropriate for agriculture and has greater rainfall. The south, as seen here, a typical example, is made up of fertile plains of a delta, whereas the coastline is rich with harbors and port cities and forming a maritime trading network. The north, however, with the Yellow River, known as China's Sorrow, floods occasionally and annually, and we find that it is dry near the desert, which is hot in the summer and has rigid and frigid cold winds in the winter, thus a very inhospitable climate. Now, just like the areas that supported agriculture in the Near East, we find that China is going to reap the benefits of their exchanges with the Near East in the year 3000 BCE, when they learn about grain. It is at this time that they are shared with this information from the Near East and learn how to cultivate different types of grains. This is not the first example of agriculture, however, in China. Agriculture actually arises here independently, with rice and millet nearly 2,000 years before then, and 5000 BCE. Now, given the annual rains and floods in the region, grain would not grow as rapidly and readily, but rice and millet will, and so these terrace sections were developed to grow and to produce and process this food source. The first cities to be settled are going to be Jiangzhai and Banpo. These represent the earliest settlements in China, just as the Indus Valley civilization was in South Asia in India. Here in Jiangzhai, a settlement of 4000 BCE, we have nearly 100 dwellings that were in existence early on for different family units. The communal center is going to arrange this small village with an area which included stables and a road connecting it, whereas outside of a series of walls we had burials in a cemetery as well as kilns in the southwestern section of this given early settlement. The bowl, seen here from the Yangshao culture, which existed from 5000 to 3000 BCE, is made up of a turned-out rim, which is highly polished and uniform in shape. Here we have the turned-out rim shown on its back so that we can actually appreciate the little ledge that is going to be protruding in this type of ceramic ware. Now, the potter's wheel had not yet been invented. This happens around the 1100s BCE. So at this time, these are all going to be made by hand, and so the uniformity is quite amazing. The development in the technology relating to pottery is actually slow and experimental. Non-specialist potters would actually make small batches for ceremonial purposes early on, such as for religious ceremonies and burials. Often they would house and or hold medicinal or narcotic plants to be consumed as part of these ceremonies. And because there were no throwing wheels or kick wheels, these would be made by hand. Therefore, the precision is going to be quite impressive. It is only later that we have specialists who do nothing but create pottery that would share recipes to mass produce said pots. And this would only be possible after 1100, when we have the standardized kick wheel to produce large scale and mass produced items for eating and cooking. Before then, people did not eat off of plates or drink out of goblets. On the bowl seen here, during the Yangzhou Neolithic period, we see human faces flanked by fish. Now, the writing system in China follows with the tradition in other areas of the world, such as the Middle East. So in Western culture, cuneiform writing is the earliest, developing from pictographs around 3400 BCE to actual writing as we would understand it today with these letter forms around 3000. These are going to be made with a stylus pressed into clay. Now in China, they developed their writing system much the same way as in Mesopotamia, beginning with pictographs and then slowly developing them into letter forms that are more symbolic. This occurs between 1200 and 1050 BCE, quite a bit later than the West. Here's an example of how the Chinese alphabet develops. As in the West, we begin with a picture of something that is representational, such as a tree, a mountain, or water, and then slowly abstract that until we have the forms seen all the way at the right that are the appearance of, but in an abstract quality, their original drawing, such as the notion of the sun, which was a circle with a dot turning into a square with a strike in the center, or the moon as going to be a crescent shape with two horizontal stripes in the center. Early on, one can see these pictographs slowly being abstracted. Here we have perhaps an ancestral figure that would assure the abundance of a catch of fish, giving how important fishing was to this culture. Now, the fact that we have an ancestral figure here that will figure largely in Chinese art moving forward, we have the importance of ancestor worship established early on in this culture, as well as the worship of nature spirits. Recent excavations have found another 5,000-year-old culture all the way in the Bay of Hangzhou. Here we find the Langzhou culture flourished between 3400 and 2250 BCE. This culture is going to produce human and animal images as masks or faces with large round eyes, flat noses, and rectangular mouths. This is very interesting given the forms that they choose, the materials, and the subject matter. The guang here are cylindrical tubes that are encased in a rectangular block, are often carved in jade, or we should say ground out in jade. Here we have an example of a standard guang in this culture. Now, jade, given that it is hard and brittle, cannot be carved as we understand it in the Western tradition, such as marble in the subtractive process. Instead, they would use sand as an abrasive measure to slowly grind down the material because it would shatter otherwise, much like a crystal or glass. Now, the guang here from this culture is going to have on it images of a very important subject for this people. It represents supernatural beings, most likely dead ancestors, though deities have also been suggested. Later Chinese historians would call these ancient mask motifs daodi, and so we find that daodi becomes a common identifier for the iconography in Chinese art that we'll discuss moving forward. However, the exact meaning of these daodi are lost, for they are not written down since this is produced before the advent of the Chinese alphabet. Now, the Bronze Age in the Near East is going to arise around 3000 BCE at the same time of the emergence of writing and other agricultural and animal husbandry activities. Here, metallurgy, that's going to produce bronze, which is an alloy or a combination of different metals, specifically tin and copper, are going to revolutionize farming and warfare. Now, copper ore was widely available in the Near East, but it is quite soft. Now, if you combine it with tin, then weapons and tools could be fashioned, war and trade, as well as agriculture in the Middle East forever. Now, the Bronze Age in China comes along a millennium later in 2000 BCE, but unlike their Western counterparts, the Chinese do not use bronze hollow casting. Instead, they develop what's called piece mold casting. Unlike bronze hollow casting, with piece mold casting, you first create a model in clay, letting it dry. Next, you are going to take the original model that serves as a core. Then you are going to take the pieces and reassemble it around that original core. Now, once the metal cools, the mold will be broken apart, giving you some of the earliest examples of metalwork in China, like the Fang Ding here, this ceremonial cooking vessel. Now, there are three Bronze Age dynasties in China: the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou. We will discuss each one of them now. The Shang ruled between 1700 and 1100 BCE and produced walled cities, palaces, and royal tombs. This was a stratified society with a warrior culture and focus on war, where rulers controlled Bronze Age technology. Thus, they control weapons and producing ritual vessels, showing that they are in charge both of warfare and of religion, speaking for the supernatural world. The Shangdi, or the Great Ancestor, is considered to be the chief Shang deity or god. Regular sacrifices were necessary to keep the spirits of dead ancestors vital in order to help the living. So, of course, just like the votive offerings that are given in the West, these sacrifices are given as gifts to ensure that the continued support of one's dead ancestors can help you. Now, Shang priests are going to practice divination just as we discussed in Africa, whereby you would inscribe a question on a bone or a tortoise shell. You then would heat the bone or tortoise shell until it cracked. Depending upon where and how it cracked, you would then interpret these oracle bones that speak for the supernatural world. And interestingly enough, these form the earliest known version of Chinese writing used for religious divination, not for the keeping of records as in the West with the Mesopotamian or Sumerian culture. As with the evolution from pictorial pictograph to the modern character in Chinese, we see how this division is going to take place in evolution. The burial practices of this culture are going to be very similar to that of the earliest Bronze Age cultures in the West. For we know that humans and animals were sacrificed to accompany the deceased in death. Those included horses, we find chariots here, servants, as well as very rich materials like jade, ivory, gold, and silver. This is not unlike the royal burials that Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in 1922-34, where he found 1,800 graves also of attendants and other people sacrificed to be buried with the king. Now, some of the items buried here and were used for ceremonial purposes would have been the fangding. These bronze vessels were the most highly prized at the time and found in royal burials. These are used for food offerings for the ancestors. Thus, we have this rectangular vessel that stood up on 4 elongated legs. Now, the feasting of one's ancestors and providing food and sustenance for them is not going to be new. We see this as well in the Egyptian civilization. Another item found in these burials would be the guang, or a ritual pouring vessel. These are going to be found throughout the world and were used in ceremonial activities, especially for ritualistic libations. In the West, these are known as rhytons, whereby you would have this type of alcoholic beverages that you would drink from these animal forms. We discussed that specifically in the West associated with the Middle East and the Sumerian culture, whereby these bulls or other symbols of royal power and authority could be imbibed or taken into oneself. So we had the power of these animals. The powerful animals shown here include the largest cat on earth, the tiger, in the head portion of this vessel, and you can see how it comes apart with this top section, an S shape. The rear portion, of which the wing is visible here, and the lower portion here, as well as the eyes on the back, are going to show an owl, thus relating the object of hunting and the importance of the life of the Shang. The notion of hunting and warfare is a dominant one that will be shared with cultures across China, Eurasia, the Middle East, especially when trade with the Silk Road opens up and trade with Rome continues to flourish. This then is going to be carried on by the Mongols and the Muslims. The Zhou Dynasty conquered the Shang Dynasty in 1100 and would last until 221 BCE. They set up a feudal society where nobles are going to be related to the king and thus ruled smaller states. Tian, or heaven, as this culture called it, was a very important understanding of the supernatural world. And the king was the son of heaven, the son of Tian. So we find that the dynasty, thus, is a mandate from heaven, heavenly rule, much like those in the Middle East, starting with the Akkadians, who are going to state that they were divinely ordained to rule. Now, the tomb of Marquis Yi here is going to be found in the state of Zhang, and in it we have ritual bronzes, and these objects associated with royal burials continue just as those that we just looked at. Here we find a very elaborate set of bells from Marquis Yi's tomb. These, of course, are created around 433 BCE, and unlike the predecessors we saw a moment ago with other types of metal casting, these involve bronze hollow casting. Now, they create 65 bronze components, most of which are going to be made up of bells that are going to be set up in a 25-foot formation. They're calibrated to produce two tones that are to be played by several musicians simultaneously. Now, take a moment to watch the video on the Canvas module below this, which actually shows how these bells would have been played. These are produced by using the lost wax or bronze hollow casting method, and instead of, and unlike the piece mold method of casting, more detail can be arrived at, just like we saw in South Asia with images of Hindu and Buddhist deities. Here we have a detail of in which we can see the textural effect of bronze hollow casting that can be arrived at using this instead of piece mold. Now, music, we know, is an important function in rituals and is necessary to communicate with the supernatural world, just as with the royal burials and the bull's headed lyre and other images from the Near East, whereby musical instruments would be played to the dead in the afterlife. On the back of each one of these bells, again, we see a daudi, or an ancestral spirit. Thus we find that we are communing with the supernatural, with our dead loved ones, so that they can in fact help us and guide us and support us in this life. The Warring States period between 481 and 221 BCE follows the fall of the Zhou Dynasty, in which constant warfare defines this era. Now, at this time, alongside traditional beliefs, we find the development and shift from the supernatural world to the human world, with many philosophers and political thinkers like Confucius, Laozi, and Mozi. Out of this warring states period comes Emperor Shihuangdi, who would unite these various warring states into an empire known as the Qin that would rule between 221 and 206 BCE. Now, he began his mausoleum even before finishing the unification of China. That's how confident Xu Huangdi was. And he sought out immortality by way of his mausoleum and funerary building practices. Here at Lingtong, we have a very important find that still captures popular imagination today. In 1974, it was happened upon when peasants were digging for a well, thus uncovering one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. Here, underground, we have an army of over 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers in the mausoleum of Emperor Shihuangdi. These were created around 210 BCE, made of earthenware. The 100 life-size ceramic horses are all going to be, along with the men, in military formation, all facing east with weapons. Facing east is significant because, of course, the sun rises in the east, thus the promise of resurrection and renewal. The sun then dies in the west, so religious structures are most often oriented east-west. The tomb mound, which is near these soldiers, is left unexcavated to this day for fear of disturbing the remnants and the find inside of it. Here we have the differentiated soldiers. Of course, what is interesting is they are idiosyncratic. They are not the same as though you would have had a cookie cutter mold of just one type of soldier like you might find in other parts of the world. Instead, they are going to be individualized. Here we can see that the features, the physiognomy, as well as the detail of facial hair, of eyes, and of the forms of the nose, eyes, lips, and ears, all are going to be carefully observed, as well as the hair. Now, the tomb does remain unopened, but it is believed to reproduce the world as the Qin knew it, with the stars overhead and rivers and mountains below. Thus, this would ensure the underworld would match the human. And like the Egyptians and the Etruscans before them, they would include everything that was needed in this world and a view of this world to continue living in the next, hence to ensure one's immortality. The Qin dynasty was quite harsh and repressive and followed a system of rule called legalism, in which all other philosophies other than the official ideology espoused by the emperor were banned. Scholars were executed and books were burned. However, the Qin did mold a centralized bureaucracy that would be used for millennia. We find that they divided the various provinces of China that continued largely unchanged until today. They standardized coinage and the writing system used across this vast empire and built roads, much like the Romans had in the Roman Empire, to connect these vast areas. All of these are still in use today. Therefore, the Qin can be related to ancient Rome in the same way. They also connected the battlements on the northern frontier to make what we now know as the Great Wall, which is actually a series of separate sections of a wall that are fragmented. This, of course, is designed to prevent the Mongols from invading from the north in Mongolia. Following the Qin, we have the Han Dynasty that ruled between 206 and 220. We should say 206 BCE and 220 Common Era. This represents a period of peace, prosperity, and stability for China, for they would open the Silk Road and trade with Rome, so great economic prosperity can be found in this period, and an exchange of ideas. The Han Dynasty represents the end of the mythocentric age, where there is a belief in the close relationship between the human and supernatural worlds. So as we see the Han Dynasty slowly developing and evolving, we see the interest in the supernatural will change focus to the everyday here on earth. But here is an example of the worldview of the Chinese at this time, in which the universe is going to be shown divided between heaven, earth, and the underworld. Heaven is going to be shown at the top, with earth down below, and finally the underworld below it. The greatest section is given to heaven itself, where we find the sun is going to be housing a mythical crow to the right here. The moon, on the other hand, is going to have the mythical toad. The torch dragon can be seen here in the center, which is a primordial deity represented as a man with a serpent's tail. Down below, we have a gate with two guardian figures, because of course not just anyone can make their way into heaven. They must pass through these protected gates. Dragons are going to intertwine here in the center and loop through a circular jade piece that forms the bee, or the symbol of heaven, in the center here. Above this bee, we have the first stage of the heavenly realm, whereby the deceased is accompanied by 3 attendants on a platform, with 2 kneeling attendants that welcome him into heaven. Below, we find the earthly and the underworld realms. These include the bronze bells, stone chimes, and a ritual bronze vessel, where we have music and food and wine for the deceased, which should seem familiar now given the excavations we've found and the items in royal burials. Down below, we have a muscular man who holds up a platform on a pair of fish that's also in the shape of a bee. The fish and other creatures are going to be found here in the underworld, populating it as well. All of the items shown here as part of the funerary rites and rituals are actually found in burials. And so we find that this is not merely a fantastical and imaginative rendition, but references how actual burial practices were carried out and perceived, that have bells, that have these containers for food and drink. This is not unlike the Egyptians and other cultures that also had ritualistic offerings of food and beer and these libations in the underworld. The mythocentric view shown in this Han example is going to be retained in the West all the way through Christianity, which showcases those who live here alongside the supernatural, alongside figures from the afterlife, or from the supernatural realm. They are, however, going to be abandoned in China. Now, under the Han, we find that we abandon these instead to be replaced by Taoism and Confucianism. Now, Taoism is going to be developed from the text Tao Jing, which literally translates the way and its power, originally written by philosopher Lao Tzu. This was expanded on by Zhuangzi in the text which is eponymously titled Zhuangzi. Both of these texts form the basis for Taoism. Now, Tao, the central component to Taoism, literally means the way or the path, and is going to be focused on recovering what was, again, unlearned, if you will. So in order to understand something in the true way and the path, we must unlearn what we have been taught all our lives and practice Wu Wei, otherwise known as non-doing, and we must strive for non-striving. Now, these terms are very often cryptic, but are understood through the metaphor of one trying to swim against the current. Instead of trying to swim against the current, we are to let ourselves be carried away by it, to not go against the flow of the universe. Now, Han rulers are also interested in immortality, but think that they can achieve it here on earth, that we do not need a supernatural component for it. So Taoism believes that there is a close relationship between humans and nature, and that we find they absorb this belief into folk practices and this search for immortality. They believe that immortal life on earth can be achieved and attained through diet and exercise and other practices that are tied directly to and impactful of your physical being. An example of this notion of immortality can be seen here in this incense burner from 113 BCE, representing a popular Taoist legend, the land of immortals in the Eastern Sea. Now, this is an incense burner that is going to be designed to look like a mountainous island with birds, animals, and immortals that is shrouded in mist whenever the incense is burning. Seen here, we have the type of incense placed at the base that would obscure this in this type of smoke, to where, just as it was believed there was a place where people lived as immortals on earth, that this could be attained by way of Taoism and of self-control exercise and proper dieting on earth here. Here we have a detail of these small figures seen up in these mountains that, of course, have found a way to preserve their lives and live forever. Now, Confucianism is going to be another one of these philosophies that is based on the world here, and is centered on the human world. It is based on a rational political philosophy that emphasizes propriety, deference, duty, and self-discipline, all qualities that will be appreciated and appreciable by Chinese rulers moving forward. The Han would adopt Confucianism as the official imperial philosophy, for it is going to be central for reverence relating to one's ancestors and correct relationships, as well as respect for authority, which is so important if you were a ruler. It would be Emperor Wu Di, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, who made Confucianism the official imperial philosophy. Han philosophers would then in turn infuse with this type of Chinese cosmology into Confucianism and relate that the emperor in fact ruled by heavenly mandate, that the heavens themselves and the divine and supernatural realm demanded that he rule. Therefore, we have this moral system that is in Confucianism related to universal order that already existed in the local tradition. Therefore, in images of daily life now, we no longer see the afterlife and or heaven and hell, or the underworld as the Chinese would understand it. Instead, we see images from everyday life relating to respect for the emperor, filial piety, and wifely devotion, all things that lay squarely within the realm of the everyday, the human world, and could be understood and controlled thereby. Here we find the empress in this upper section receives visitors in the upper floor of this palace, while the emperor receives visitors in the lowest floor. The procession in this section out front is where visitors and chariots are on their way to the palace, all showing deference and respect for the emperor. Humans, in fact, are going to no longer be in the supernatural realm, but as mentioned, now we are focusing clearly and squarely on the human realm and human behavior. Finally, turning to architecture, we have the information that is all that we have left from this period relates to ceramic models in tombs and houses for the dead. So here we have the tomb model of a house and a tower, this one from the 1st century Common Era. This is a 7-story dwelling. The lower story is going to be dedicated to livestock, pigs and oxen. The 2nd story is dedicated to storage of goods, and the upper section is where families actually live. This is very common for building in Asia and even areas in Europe. The sources that we have here tell us that the walls of the palaces were decorated with murals and inlaid with precious stones, especially prized in the Han Dynasty. This bracketing system seen here in the 1st century already foretells the elements that project from the wall, supporting these broad eaves of tiled roofs that would become a standard element in Asian architecture in the future in both palaces and temple designs. Next time we'll continue on with the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties in China and the impact that outside religions have here, such as Buddhism and others.